Yeah, my name is Leonie Edmead. I am a textile graduate and I specialised in weaving. So my presentation today will explore how textiles, dress and identity interact in relation to colonialism and how this has impacted textiles as a communicative tool of identity. Textiles. So the way that my presentation will go is kind of through pre-colonial to post-colonial textiles. So I started off by looking at pre-colonial textiles and dress, and the research followed the ways in which textiles were produced in colonial societies, particularly in the Caribbean, focusing on production of West Indians, how we approach the decolonial textile discourse, and as Caribbean descendants, how we can navigate this conversation and reinstate the importance of identity and textiles. So in the first instance, I wanted to understand how textiles were produced in this period. So from analysing many sources, it can be said that centuries before colonialism developed, textiles played a huge role in portraying identity in many West African cultures. For example, in modern day Nigeria, cloth made from fragments of bark and raffia dating back to the 9th to 11th centuries have been recovered. And in addition, the Kasanga and the Manjak tribes were known during the 15th century for the quality of their weaving, as were the countries of the Gulf of Benin and interior regions of West Africa. It can be said that producing textiles was a prominent craft in many parts of pre-colonial West Africa, with men often dominating the production, as you can see here in the source, a weaver at his loom in Senegal circa 1780s. Textiles have been used in these communities as a tool of communication for centuries, often representing the social status, religions, and for celebratory occasions. The techniques that they used during these times include weaving, dyeing, and embroidery, all of which were used methodically. So as mentioned before, I am a weaver. I specialised in weaving during my second year of studying at university. And it was something that kind of took me by surprise. I didn't go into university thinking that I'd be a weaver, but I grew to really appreciate the craft. And weaving was known to be one of the oldest crafts in Ghana. Not only was it used to produce ordinary cloth, but we have groups such as the Ashanti Kente weavers who developed a highly ornate collection of fabrics. As seen in this source here, not only are they really amazing to look at, but they have a lot of symbolism behind them. And at this time, Europeans were quite threatened by these well-established cloths, as there were no market for their textile imports as desired. The range of ethnic groups, cultures, and materials across West Africa made their textiles so diverse and incomparable to European textiles. And this offers further evidence that these textiles were produced in order to display such unique and West African identities. So moving on, in the 15th to 17th centuries, there was a developing relationship between West African and European and Middle Eastern traders, particularly trading imported fibres. And these were incorporated with more traditional textiles. So for example, we had a lot of silks and cottons imported from Europe and Asia, and many West Africans adopted these new fibres, such as the Ashanti Kente weavers, who traditionally wove with natural fibres, but now incorporated these new fibres. These fibres were more luxurious in quality and therefore were reserved for the royalty and wealthy. And here we begin to see the relationship between materials and status, with luxurious materials equating to higher importance. This source really stood out to me whilst I was doing my research, as I began to kind of understand what the relationship between textiles and dress and how you can separate the production of textiles and the wearers, the dressmakers or whoever else, and kind of begin to understand the relationship here. So this is an illustration of women from Sierra Leone dancing, and it's said that they're distinguished from the others because of their head ornaments and jewellery, but alongside that, because of their use of rich silks or taffeta cloths. So this is where I began to draw links between the fact that luxurious textiles were now related to higher importance and so on. Further sources I came across were the Benin plaques, And I felt this was really important to look at as well, to kind of get a bigger understanding of the context of dressing at the time. So it's possible that the oba, as seen in the center, also known as the king, that his wrap was made of other materials that were deemed for the wealthy, or the textiles were purposely more patterned to identify his importance. And in contrast, all of the dressing styles of his attendants show that he is more important than them. So it is clear to see who is more important as the textiles were used, and the style of dress corresponded accordingly. And in the absence of photography, the plaques were reliable in revealing the intricate details of the textiles and depicts the story and figures from parts of pre-colonial West Africa. In some communities in West Africa, less clothes were worn by people, and materials were often fashioned to cover genital areas. Many communities embrace nudity, which seems to fit in with the geographical location, but it can't be assumed that the climate was the only factor for this. And in some communities, the achievement of adulthood was in part celebrated by the assumption of adult dress. Coming of age ceremonies may have included the change symbolically from nudity to dress. The view on modesty within some West African communities began to change, where there were more religious influences, and subsequently an amalgamation of dressing styles emerged. In some religions, nudity was often viewed as primitive, particularly from European viewpoints, and I found this really explicitly equated to lower status and backwardness, which is something I pick up further on in my research. So overall, for this part of my research, I found that the sources were really useful in understanding that there was a really rich history surrounding textiles and dress in pre-colonial West Africa, and it can't be homogenized as they were unique in their own rights. Textiles and dress were telling of the range of established West African identities through the colors, materials, and techniques used. So moving on, the most notable change in the Western textile industry was the development of the transatlantic slave trade, which changed how West Africans would contribute to producing textiles in a global context. By the late 18th century, cotton was an extremely popular commodity produced as part of this slave trade, and an estimated 12.5 million people from much of West Africa were enslaved by Europeans from the mid-15th century into the 19th century. Due to the climate and geographical locations of the islands of the Caribbean, they became the perfect location to produce the infamous West Indian Sea Island cotton. And this cotton, as seen here in the source, is described as one of the most ancient and precious cotton types in the world, and was discovered in the early 18th century in the Caribbean. So here I wanted to analyze how the growing cotton industry in the Caribbean disconnected the identity of these enslaved West Africans and subsequently their descendants. In pre-colonial West Africa, it was understood that many creative textile practices existed and were very much embedded into society. The characteristics of these textiles were telling of the cultures they belonged to and further enforced one's identity, whether that be the craftsman's or the wearer's. In contrast, the enslaved did not get to contribute much more than the forced and excruciating physical labor of picking the cotton. The shift in status impacted how people were able to identify themselves at the time, and the rest of the cotton production was controlled by the European traders, which was a good way to boost their economies, but also a way for them to disguise the immorality of the transatlantic slave trade, and moreover, to erase the enslaved people's identities. The European fabrics created from this trade had no telling of the identity of the enslaved people who worked strenuously for centuries helping to build these industries. And arguably, these enslaved people indirectly helped to build the reputation and thus the identity of many places in Europe. For example, Manchester even coined the term Cottonopolis because of its huge involvement in the trade, and some 4,500 mills were fueled by the raw cotton production during this slave trade. We also have examples of other associations, such as the British Cotton Growing Association in 1901, which is an example of how imperial powers were able to sustain control over this production. Cotton cultivated in St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, was sent to England from 1724 until around 1970, which contributed greatly to the British economy, with cotton valued at over £45,000 produced between 1912 to 1914, which is an estimated £5.7 million today. Next, I wanted to explore how colonialism impacted the style of dress in these colonized societies, mainly in the Caribbean. So on one hand, it can be said that colonialism stifled self-expression to a fair extent because European dressing styles were largely influential and widely adopted by colonized communities. So I came across this source of a Jamaican woman wearing her best clothes. And what I found quite striking about the image was how much it resembled the Victorian style of dress, which were described as her best clothes. At this point in my research, I found it really hard to get an understanding of what dressing styles were like for people who were enslaved. There wasn't much to go by and understand if there was a similar type of connection or relationship between the wearer and the craftsman, as we'd seen in pre-colonial West Africa, where weavers would weave fabrics and then these were used by dancers or by royalty. Here, it was really hard to kind of get a grasp of what these communities, how they looked, how they dressed, what they were able to express through the textiles that they wore. And the fact that these were some of this woman's best clothes suggests that during this period that European style of dress implied civility. This was linked to civility. Dress was made from Osnaburg since high quality materials were banned from being worn by most of the enslaved, and they were forced to wear low quality materials. So Osnaburg was a coarse and cheap fabric imported from Europe. This supports the idea that textiles were used purposefully through dress to set dressing style standards, and so the enslaved had to conform to these. And in turn, the Europeans maintained control over the enslaved, and many West African identities were erased through dressing styles. And if the enslaved were able to unapologetically be self-expressive through dress, it may have countered the idea that they were viewed as property and not people who had identities. However, enslaved people were not to adapt and be resourceful, called the set girls, and they often paid for their own costumes for carnival. And being a set girl was to be part of a group that was presumably a safe haven and allowed these women to take control of their style of dress. Some styles of dress had deep roots of West African styles, whereas others may have had more of an influence of European cultures. But whether their dressing styles were highly influenced by the Europeans or not, the enslaved people still had a margin to be self-expressive somewhat. And what follows are the lasting impacts of colonialism and the narrative of reinstating traditional and developed identities using textiles. Moving on to the post-colonial textiles and dress discourse, it can be argued that in the post-colonial period that we're in, many West African and Caribbean people are battling neo-colonialism to decolonize the textiles. There was a huge decline in the cotton production in many Caribbean islands, causing them to turn to other trades such as tourism. Few islands have continued to produce West Indian Sea Island cotton for European companies, such as an Italian company called Albini, and they produce fabric with 90% of the exclusive production in Jamaica and 100% of the exclusivity of Sea Island cotton grown in Barbados. The prominent use of textiles as a way of communicating cultures in the post-colonial fashion scene has been important in changing how fashion was perceived in the Western world. So this wraps up the overview of my research and leads on to the practical element of my final major project, all of which was informed by my dissertation findings. So the aim of my final major project was to create a body of work split into collections that reflected my own heritage. So as mentioned before, I have a Caribbean background with all of my grandparents being from St. Kitts. So it was really important for me to showcase this through my work, as well as making informed choices on material and colour and the final context to reflect all of my research. So this, what you can see now, is kind of my initial visual research, where I started off with looking at imagery from St. Kitts. So in the top left, you can see a small image of a police station in a small village called Tabernacle in St. Kitts. And just below that to the right, you can see a small shack, which was actually my paternal grandfather's house. So I wanted to really draw a lot of personal links to my work, to my visual work, as well as pulling other parts of imagery that I felt could inform my colour palettes, could inform the texture. It was a very fluid opening to my project. Having done all of that research, I really wanted to make sure that there were links and I didn't go off on a tangent. So I did start quite open with my imagery research and pulling together colour palettes and so on. But I wanted to really hone in on the use of West Indian Sea Island cotton. And so two of the three of my collections feature this cotton, and the first being my Carnival collection. So this was inspired by Carnival, and I felt that was really fitting, linking into the research that I had done and the fact that Carnival was a time for people of the Caribbean, of these colonies who were enslaved, for them to be self-expressive somewhat, and that tradition has continued to this present day. So my initial visual research used the bold use of colour, and I also drew inspirations from Ghanaian textiles, both to make cultural links between West Africa and the Caribbean, and to also, on a more skillful level, to experiment with block weaving techniques. So as in my collections, so in summer 2020, I undertook an internship with a shirt company called Turnbull and Nasser. I was really fortunate to make a really good link with a lady called Laura who works for Albini. That's the same company that actually has 100% exclusivity of the production in Barbados. So I was fortunate enough to be granted with some of the West Indian Sea Island cotton. Really excited to get my hands on, because I wasn't sure where I could source it from initially. So I was glad to be able to get that and use that for my work. So the material development for my Carnival collection focused on kind of combining the vibrancy of my colour palette here. And so even though I had kind of started off really, really bold with the Carnival collection, I did draw other palettes from other work that I had done. So I opted for a more muted palette, but there was still quite a bit of vibrancy there. And I combined that with some cooler colours as well, drawn from other imagery. These samples were woven with a combination of the cotton and some viscose as well. And my approach to designing is often very improvised. So even though I do collect a lot of imagery in the first instance before I weave, I much prefer to kind of create as I go along. So for context, this was kind of like the height of the pandemic. So there wasn't a lot of access to studios. So I really had to be selective with what I chose to make up as I was going along, even though that was kind of probably not the best approach at the time. But it's what I feel like works best for me, especially kind of referencing the Ashanti Kente weavers who told stories through their work. That was something that I wanted to do here. So drawing colour palettes from personal imagery, drawing ideas from Ghanaian textiles, and kind of creating these block woven pieces. As you can see here, they did kind of come together, but at first it was very experimental and just trying new things and working things out and just trying to encompass all of my research in a fabric. So here are some more of my final samples for this collection. And a few more here. So as you can see, I've kind of grouped them into color palettes, but I also was able to work on multiple looms. So I worked on a floor loom, so that allowed me to kind of create a lot of different patterning, and there were more than one. It's quite a complicated process weaving. It's a lot to kind of get your head around, but I really enjoyed kind of being able to experiment whilst I had access to the university, and kind of experimenting with different types of weaving structures, similar to some of the Ashanti Kente cloth that I had looked at for reference. but also trying to kind of draw my inspiration from the Caribbean, but also not make it very kind of cliche in a sense, something that you would kind of have to look into, and once you got to understand the history behind it and all of the research and stuff, it would make a lot more sense. But from looking at it, it would kind of make you drawn in, if that makes sense. So that was the aim for this collection. In terms of my visualizations, I really wanted to revolve them around a fashion context, mainly because I wanted to relate to my research around dress and identity. So the idea for this shoot was to present the modern day image of how I see my fabrics being used as a communicative tool of identity through modern fashion. So my friend Abdi Malik Ibrahim, he's a photographer, he's still a student, but he's amazing, and helped me with this presentation, presenting these fabrics. And the model is my beautiful friend, Karima. She's also has a similar background to me, with her parents being from St. Kitts and Montserrat. So I thought that was really fitting to bring all of this together and kind of create this small lookbook of how I would visualize my fabrics, as again, because of the time constraints, I wasn't able to weave lengths and lengths and create an actual garment. So this was my next best option. So moving on to my second collection that featured the West Indian seal and cotton. This was my jacquard collection. So it's my final collection, and I wanted to create a more literal representation of my cultural background, mainly because a lot of people associate textiles with printed fabrics. And although this is something that I can do, I really wanted to push my skills and create a jacquard collection from my hand-drawn prints. So I've started off with, similarly how I start off with most of my projects, with my visual research, paper cuttings, ink drawings. And for this, I really wanted to do something simple that I felt I could translate very well. And so I thought looking at botanical imagery from St. Kitts would be a fitting idea. So my motifs were hand drawn with ink, and then I digitally manipulated them into repeat patterns. So you can see on the right, that's a small sample of my jacquard file that I translated from one of the small ink mark makings that I just kind of put together. As I said before, I really like to improvise. There is thought behind the process, but a lot of the time I just kind of go with it with an open mind. And here are some examples of how I developed these into repeat patterns. So this was just for technical use only, thinking about how I would put my work together, having a background color, and then using different structures to push the imagery. And this is how they developed as jacquard samples. Again, I used the West Indian seal and cotton. So it had a cotton background, and then I used all of the seal and cotton in the West. And it was really lovely to use this because in the other samples, you didn't get much of a gradient effect with some of the space dyed yarns that I'd done with the cotton. So here it's really nice to kind of see how the colors developed, and you kind of got a softer palette with these pieces. Once again, I developed these into a final collection and experimented with a bit more chenille yarns as well as the seal and cotton, just to set it apart a bit. So for the context, again, sticking with the fashion context, I really wanted to refashion a traditional Kittitian style shirt with my jacquards. So my paternal grandfather was a tailor by trade. So I had one of his shirts that my dad kept and visualized my fabrics on his shirt, which is something I hope he would be proud of if he could see it. And it was really kind of heartwarming for me to bring that personal element into my project again. And once again, I had one of my friends who's also got a Kittitian background to model the shirt for me. And I was able to visualize my work again. So that was my final major project. I'm currently still developing my practice and understanding of how I will move forward as a storyteller and an artist through my weaving. I really want to give a massive thank you to Ellie and Clifford for this opportunity, and thank you all for tuning in.